This story begins with the birth of three babies, Naisha, Jorge, and Sebastian, which were born on the same day at the same time, but each one in a different part of Colombia. Naisha was born in a small indigenous community in the Guajira, Sebastian in a middle-class family in Bogotá, and Jorge in a village in Putumayo. The three of them were leading a normal life. They all started going to the school. They learned how to read, how to write, how to add, the normal things we all learn when we are little. Of course, their skills were very different, but at the end of the day, they fulfilled their only function, which was to teach them the basics, and everything was going very well. The real problem began to be noticed as they grew up, because their lives turned out to be very different. For example, when Naisha returned home, she had to learn how to weave baskets. Jorge had to return home to help to milk the cows. And when Sebastian returned to his apartment, he had to do his homework accompanied by a very hot cup of chocolate. But the difference didn't end there, because their mentality regarding to the study wasn't very similar either. For Naisha and Jorge, studying was a privilege that they couldn't afford, because the economic crisis was hard. And on the other hand, for Sebastian, studying was the most important thing. And even if he didn't like it very much, it was his only obligation. And of course, the economy wasn't easy for that family either. But it was clear to them that studying was the only thing that could give him a better future. And so the years went by, Naisha continued weaving baskets, Jorge learned more about agriculture, and Sebastian finished school. One day, a recruiter from an university came to their houses, and he was offering them a free university degree. Sebastian didn't think twice. It was the perfect opportunity. But instead, Naisha and Jorge were not even interested, because they hadn't finished school, and this simply wasn't part of their future plans, because what could a college degree add to the work they did at home? And clearly, the answer for them was nothing. And so it stayed. Sebastian went to college and learned more about the reality of the world, while Naisha and Jorge stayed in their hometown, working the fields and attending to their farming duties. Have you ever heard about the myth of the Plato's cave? Well, that's an allegory that seeks to explain the way in which people comes to obtain knowledge. And the story you just heard is my adaptation of it, only that it has been taken into a more realistic context and related to a world problem. Once the context in which I propose the allegory and adaptation of the myth has been clarified, we can start talking about the main problem, which is inequity. And this topic could be related to so many aspects because it is part of the daily bread of thousands of people in Latin America. However, I will focus on what many call the basis of humanity, which is education in the early years. Because childhood is the stage that has the most influence in our lives, since it is here where all the bases for what we will be in the future are formed, shaping our behavior on a social and individual level. And that's why child education is very important, and not only to be seen from the point of view of work, but also as a tool for the formation of independent, self-sufficient people with their own criteria for action. But this doesn't happen in the same way for everyone, since the lack of educational opportunities and quality on the most vulnerable populations such as indigenous and those living in rural areas is something latent, and that despite that there have been so many attempts for change this, it is still a big problem. In fact, according to the UN, dropout rates are higher in rural areas than in urban areas, and between a 20 and a 40% drop out from school just before starting secondary. That's huge. And this is due to many reasons, such as economic crisis, army conflict, forced displacement, among others, what will result in the student falling behind their studies and leaving them. But the history is different in urbanizations, because the environment here is generally much healthier and children have more opportunities, demonstrating the huge inequity that exists in Latin American education. But this doesn't end here. Because we have seen how this problem is also affecting more elements. And the most important one is digital literacy, because the basic skills are no longer reading and writing. And that's because with the arrival of technology, knowing how to handle an electronic device is something fundamental to being competent on society. But the most vulnerable population doesn't receive the adequate training to acquire these skills, leaving them behind in the possibilities of getting into the society. And to explain a little more this last argument, I ask myself a question. What happens with these populations when we have to face a situation like the present one, in which, due to external forces, everything must be handled from the technology? And well, over the years we have seen how the development of the society and technology go hand in hand, but that unfortunately the marginalized populations don't join in. And although this problem has been kept in the shadows, the pandemic has brought out all the gaps in the use of technology with educational purposes. And this is because the most of teachers and students don't have the adequate training or the necessary resources to educate themselves in the camping situation, what will affect the intellectual and personal growing of the student, and what will also result in a notable backwardness of the country, in which I allude to the 2014 Nobel Peace Prize. A country is not stronger by the number of soldiers it has, but by its literacy rate. Malala Yousafzai. It's essential that we take this problem very seriously, because education is one of the most important aspects to achieve changes in the world. And with technology, we have the tools for making this possible. But we must start using them in our favor. And not only for privileged populations, but for each of the people who want to learn, whether high or low resources. And we cannot stay with the typical solutions of providing more GDP, of training more teachers, of improving installations, because that's something primordial that should always be sought. What we really have to do is to think about these populations, is to adapt education for them, is to be able to guarantee good quality of life in every part of the country. And we must start teaching our children into the digital age, into emotional intelligence, into proposing solutions, into being able of standing on their own 2 feet. Basically, to not fall into the initial problem history, in which only one of the 3 had the tools for reach to the ideal world. And also it sounds very utopian or cliché, but if we all work together, the future of our generations and of the entire world will change completely. And as South African President Nelson Mandela said some years ago, the most powerful weapon we have to change the world is education. So, I know what I'm going to do now, but what are you going to do now?